Hey y'all, Melissa here with you today, and we are continuing our series on how to alter your patterns so they fit better. Today we're going to talk about the concept of finished measurements and pattern ease so that you have a better idea of how to estimate what a pattern is going to look like once you are wearing it. As I mentioned in the last video of this series, the foundation of all of these skills is having accurate measurements of yourself. Once you've done that, if your pattern doesn't include every finished measurement and you want a better idea of how this is going to fit you when it's finished, the very first thing I recommend doing is marking off your seam allowances. So you can see I'm using my Austin t-shirt pattern, which is available in my shop, and it is the one that I am currently wearing as well. And it does have the back neck to hem length included on the pattern. That is so that people can determine if they want to lengthen or shorten their shirts based on their preferred t-shirt length and the length of their own torsos. But that is the only finished measurement that I include on there. There's a reason for this. I've found over the years of selling patterns that if I include a lot of finished measurements, beginners get confused and they don't know whether to use the finished measurements to determine what size pattern to make or the size chart that comes with the pattern. So I would say you should always start with the pattern size chart. No matter if it's from my shop or any other shop, look at the size chart. The first thing you're going to want to do to calculate the finished measurements is go ahead and mark off these seam allowances. So this particular pattern, it says that there is a 1/2 inch seam allowance included, and I am just going to use this clear ruler and I'm going to mark myself a red line of where that 1/2 inch seam allowance is. Now, I do not need to mark a seam allowance on anything that's cut on the fold because there's no seam there. Okay, so on my back pattern piece, you can see where I have marked those seam allowances. I'm going to set this aside. I'm going to do this on the front as well. Once you have the seam allowances marked out, then it's easier to start measuring. For example, if I wanted to know what the finished bust measurement on this particular pattern might be, first I would measure in the bust area here from that seam allowance to the fold. So you can see that this is approximately 8 1/8 inches. And then I would measure over here. Now, this particular t-shirt, you can see from the pattern cover, has two options. There's the one that I'm wearing where you can cut the front on the fold on this line, or there is a split neck one where there is a seam allowance. So I need to make sure that I'm only measuring to the fold line because that is also the seam line for the split neck version. And what I'm gonna get, you'll see, is 8 1/2. So 16 5/8, which is 8 1/2 plus 8 1/8 added together is half of the body because that's going to cover half of the front and half of the back. If I multiply that times 2, I'm going to come up with a finished bust measurement here of 33 1/4 inches. Now that is actually a little bit smaller than my actual bust, and that is where we get into pattern wearing ease. So ease is the amount of difference from your body measurement that is included in a pattern. With knit patterns, you can have negative ease, where the pattern is going to measure less than your body. And that's because knit fabric stretches. So you'll notice that a lot of knit patterns will specify a specific amount of stretch for their fabrics. That is specified because the designer wants to make sure that the pattern is going to stretch enough to compensate for whatever negative ease is included in the pattern. With woven patterns, since they do not stretch, woven fabric is not going to stretch to the extent that a knit fabric will, there's going to be usually positive ease. Positive ease is going to mean that the bust measurement on a woven pattern is very likely going to measure more than the body measurement of the bust. you can see where this starts to get a little confusing for beginners, because you have the body size that is drafted for, and that is what is included in the size chart. And then finished measurements are going to have no ease, possibly, positive ease, or even negative ease with a knit garment. So how do you know which size to choose for yourself? Again, start with the body measurements given by the size chart for the pattern. That's going to get you approximately the same amount of ease as is pictured in the pattern. Everybody has personal preferences on ease. Some people like their t-shirts to be a little more fitted. Some people like their t-shirts to fit more loosely. So a good thing to do at that point, once you have your seam lines marked out, is to take a garment that you already like the fit on and compare it to your pattern. So here is a ready-to-wear t-shirt that I like the fit of. So I'm just going to compare this to this pattern, and that's going to give me an idea of how will this pattern fit. And the first thing I want to do is fold my t-shirt in half. Then I want to take this underarm seam here, and I'm going to line it up with the seam markings on this shirt. And what you can see is the bust is going to fit very similarly, because this point here, right up at the top of the arm side, is the exact same, like my seam allowance and my center front of my shirt here. And I need to make sure I'm lining up to the fold, not to the seam allowance. Those are in the same place, okay? It is going to be just a little tighter around the bust, so there's going to be a little more negative ease here. And it's also going to be very slightly tighter around the waist, maybe like total of a ½ inch. And then the hip is very similar. So knowing that this t-shirt is one that I like the fit of, and that it is very similar to this particular pattern, I have a good idea how this is going to fit me when I put it on. And that's a very easy thing to do, to take a garment that you already have that is made out of similar fabric to what you're going to be using, and you can just estimate, like, okay, this fit looks about like what I was looking for. I always suggest, if you are in doubt, cut your pattern bigger than your actual garment, because you can always take it in if you don't like how much ease it includes. You cannot add fabric back in though once it's cut off. One other tip to show you here how to get a general idea of how something is going to fit. I'm folding this seam allowance down here, and I'm going to fold my marked shoulder seam allowance in as well. And then I am going to literally just hold this pattern up to myself. I'm matching that shoulder seam with the shoulder seam on the shirt that I'm wearing. I'm lining up this center line, and then you can kind of look around, you know, flatten the pattern against yourself. This is helpful with woven patterns. This is helpful with patterns where you don't have a comparable garment to put on. You can kind of just hold it all up to yourself. I have even been known to go ahead and baste through paper. So like baste this seam in place and then baste the shoulder seam in place, and you can even kind of halfway put on your paper pattern. This doesn't work so well with tissue paper patterns unless you reinforce them somehow. But you can do that to get a better idea of how it's going to fit before you make the whole garment. And then of course, as always, I suggest making a muslin of any garment you're not sure of so that you can fix the fit. And muslin is just a general term. It does refer to muslin fabric, but you don't use muslin fabric for every muslin. I just use something cheap, inexpensive, and similar. So for a knit pattern, you would want to muslin it in a cheap knit fabric. You don't want to do it in a woven fabric because your fit's going to be all wrong. In this particular case, with negative ease in the bust, if I muslined this out of actual muslin, I would not be able to get the garment on because it just would not stretch over my measurements. So hopefully this video has been helpful to think about how to get finished measurements, how to think about ease, and how to have a better guess for your pattern starting size. I've got more fit tips and more fit adjustments all linked in this playlist, So make sure you check that out to help get garments that fit your personal body better.